Protected Speech with Ravi Kapur and Jonathan Choe.
Along with Jonathan Choe, I'm Ravi Kapur for another edition of Protected Speech. We're going to get into the big story of this week that affected Silicon Valley, but obviously a lot of small business folks as well, and that was the bailout of Silicon Valley Bank. A lot of folks don't want to classify it as a bailout, but the reality is there were a lot of folks that put deposits at that bank that were in excess of $250,000, which is the FDIC limit. And so it disproportionately helped a lot of folks that are running very large businesses and a ton of venture capitalists. Jonathan, I know for a lot of folks in the weeds here, maybe they weren't paying attention, but certainly it would have had a ripple effect on banks throughout the nation.
Yeah, I mean, this was a good old-fashioned bank run, right? And the money started flowing out, and rich folks, at the end of the day, that's the headline here. In my opinion, rich folks are getting bailed out once again. And for folks who haven't been following what's going on, the Biden administration said that, at the very least, the folks who, deposited money in there and trusted the bank to hold it, they're going to be made whole. However, investors in the actual bank, well, I think that's we'll have to wait to see what happens there, but they're likely not going to be getting, all of their returns. But bottom line, I think, again, people watching right now what's happening with the economy, you have situations like East Palestine, right, with that whole train derailment. Where's the government bailout there? And that's what people are asking right now. Why does this Silicon Valley Bank, again, full of folks with lots of money, get this help and support? Where's that same support for East Palestine?
Well, I think this is where I'm fascinated by the dichotomy of what took place, because Silicon Valley Bank is a really niche bank. For those of us that live and work here, as I do, you interface with these people, but you basically, by and large, have to be a venture capital, based company where you're getting capital from a large institution. These institutions have all these companies under that umbrella. They get lines of credit. They get incredible treatment, VIP meals. I've interfaced with some of their executives. They throw incredible events. So it's part of this very elite circle for the last 4 decades. And pretty much anyone who's anyone has huge amount of funds. And that's what was interesting about this, is that this was largely a bank run fueled by Twitter. I don't know if you pick up on that, Jonathan, that all these people were worried to death about the solvency of SVB. They told their companies, take your money out. And then meanwhile, they're crying because they don't want, for the folks that weren't able to get the money out in time before the FDIC and before the feds took over, they were crying that this is going to affect the economy and have a great ripple effect. And so that's what was interesting about this. It seemed like the first Twitter-fueled bank run.
Yeah, again, the power of social media, and I think a lot of times mainstream media right now losing tremendous credibility. Folks know that the mainstream media, at the end of the day, they're not going to report things right away, so they turn to social media. And if I have my money in SVB, I'm taking my money out too if I'm seeing first signs of that all cracking on social media as well.
Right. And so SVB was the first bank to go down, but there was another bank in New York called Signature Bank, and they are largely known as a cryptocurrency bank. And so Coinbase, one of the big cryptocurrency players, they announced they had hundreds of millions of dollars stashed at that bank, which is also now repossessed by the Fed. So Signature continues to exist, and SVB continues to exist, and now they're backstopped by the federal government. Will these lines of credit and will that whole infrastructure continue? That remains to be seen. But I wanted to point to a couple things, because beyond just the headlines of, a bank run and all this, there were some power players that really got involved. Now, whether they had undue influence, it's still hard to gauge, but one of the guys that had a big say is this guy named Ron Conway, very big venture capitalist, actually a very nice fellow. I met him years ago at an event. He has invested in all these name brand SaaS companies that you've heard of, software as a service companies, almost all of them. He is the penultimate angel. And so he had a corporate event, his own corporation had an event, and who did he have there speaking, Jonathan? None other than President Obama. So as this bank run situation happens, on Friday night, as this whole thing is unfolding, really over the weekend, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Conway has dinner with Nancy Pelosi, who is also his representative in San Francisco, and President Obama. Of course, who knows what kind of interaction went back on Washington, but they did have a private Zoom with hundreds of members of Congress, as was reported by some of the folks that were in on the Zoom. So all of Congress was informed about the situation, and by Sunday, it was ostensibly resolved. But it shows kind of the power and the influence of Silicon Valley. And I guess you talk about government. you get the government you pay for. And so all these folks have obviously donated tons of money to Washington on the left and the right, and their influence certainly helped to have this outcome.
Look, the average Joe Schmo just listening to you and others, they don't care. Because at the end of the day, they just see the unfairness. This is for the elites. It's for the rich. This is a failed business. At the end of the day, this is a bad business model. This never should have happened. And now they're getting a bailout. I don't really care. They'll figure it out. At the end of the day, when it comes to a crisis, the rich always get bailed out. They have connections to politicians, to influence, to power players, quote unquote, to the elites. They're not going to let this fail. At the end of the day, they have too much money involved. So again, at the end of the day, I don't care. I'm focused on places like East Palestine, where you have the average person, the household making what, $41,000 a year. They're right now going through all these different hoops. They're having to sue Norfolk Southern for that train derailment that left a whole bunch of toxic fumes and a mess to that community. That's a mess right now. So again, I see once again the unfairness. So I don't really care about what happens to SVP.
Right. And of course, the argument that they would make is, hey, they have all these small businesses that would create jobs, and there would be economic ripples and also other bank
whatever.
runs
I'm already
banks.
seeing exposure to other banks as well now. This is totally unbelievable. The markets will let the markets, settle this. At the end of the day, they're all big boys and girls. They can figure it out. They've got lots of money at the end of the day. I don't care. Let's move on.
Right. And I just will say this. The one point of contention I had with this is that everybody that's in business, as we are, there's a $250,000 limit. And these guys are making arguments that these bigger businesses have payrolls greater than that. Well, you can get insurances. You can have mechanisms to protect your funds in the bank. And so I thought some of these arguments were disingenuous, right? You give startup capital. This one bank was doing risky business. They got caught up with interest rates changing. Business. So it is. Some of these arguments were a little disingenuous, and so they should be called out for that. But there you go. I mean, that was obviously the second largest bank in the history of this country. Collapsing before our eyes within a matter of days. And that's, I think, the power of communication, right? All these Silicon Valley guys said, hey, this bank is vulnerable, take your funds out, and we got this total collapse.
And guess what? In that case, I would have listened to smart money on social media. So there you go.
And that's what people did. All right, another big story we've been following for really the last couple of years is the new ambassador to India, Eric Garcetti. He just got confirmed by the Senate, but he had been held up for a couple of years. Garcetti was the mayor of Los Angeles. Had kind of mixed results as a mayor. I know my personal interaction, Jonathan, I tried to do a sit-down interview with him a few years ago before I kind of got wind that he was looking at India. I don't know how these rumors get started, but he was looking at that. And his comms people, I think of all the people I've talked to, he did not want to talk to me. And I've looked back now in the archives, and one of the things, and I want to play a clip for you. This is during his Senate confirmation hearing. This is well over a year ago. But I want you to listen to the words that Eric Garcetti used, and then I'll get your take on the other side.
Mayor Garcetti, I want to talk a little bit about India, if I might. India was just downgraded from the annual report by Freedom House from free to partly free. They recently enacted a Citizenship Amendment Act that is very much aimed against the Muslim population within India. So the same question to you. If you could be a little more specific, India is an incredibly important strategic partner of the United States, but the human rights records there are certainly anything but the way we would like to see them. So how do you balance our need to work with India as a strategic partner, but making advancements on behalf of human rights?
Well, thank you very much, Senator. There's no question that the U.S.-India relationship should be underpinned by our common commitment to democracy, to human rights, and to civil society. It's enshrined in our constitutions, the oldest democracy in the world and the largest democracy in the world. And human rights and defense of democracy is a pillar of our foreign policy. But to answer specifically, if confirmed, I will actively raise these issues. I'll raise them with humility. It's a two-way street on these. But I intend to engage directly with civil society. There are groups that are actively fighting for the human rights of people on the ground in India that will get direct engagement from me. We know that democracies are complicated. We can look at our own and at India's, but it's a cornerstone of our shared values. And I just want to say, for me, these will not be afterthoughts. My master's degree is in human rights and international law. I've fought for human rights on 4 different continents, and it'll be a core part of what I will pursue with my Indian counterparts if confirmed.
I believe the Citizenship Amendment was passed just recently. The way it looks like it's going to be implemented, it will be very discriminatory against the Muslim population, which is very, very large. So do we have your commitment that you will be a voice in regards to any discrimination against minority groups such as the Muslim population within India?
Absolutely, Mr. Cardin. Thank you, Senator. And I would not only just bring it up, but it would not be something at the end as an obligation. It will be a core piece of what I'll be engaging my Indian counterparts have confirmed with.
So as you just heard, Garcetti goes into what he plans to do as ambassador now that he's finally been confirmed. Now, keep in mind, he got held up by other Democrats. Again, he was appointed by Biden. They finally got a 52-42 vote. There was a whole bunch of abstentions. What was interesting is even people like Dianne Feinstein and Cory Booker did not want to vote on this ambassadorship because, you know, they in New Jersey and California, huge Indian populations and a really mixed reaction to Garcetti. I don't know how much you know about Garcetti.
I don't think this really had anything to do with India in terms of the Dems. I think, it had to do with the headwinds he was facing. Again, the allegations that one of his top senior aides was accused of, some type of harassment and bullying, but that Garcetti didn't do anything about it. Of course, Garcetti denied that, but I think that's what types of headwinds he was facing when it came to the confirmation. As for all of this going on in India, yeah, look, I think Garcetti, like any politician, speaking out of the both sides of his mouth, he wants to get nominated. He knew his career as LA mayor was over, so he's just going to say whatever he's going to say to appease whoever's asking him the questions at that time. So we're going to have to wait and see what he actually does now that he's been confirmed.
So, yeah, Garcetti's going to have folks watching him like a hawk. I mean, certainly all the business groups that we follow that do a lot of U.S.-India stuff, they were
in other words, the Hindu groups. Because I think the Muslims obviously want an advocate like Garcetti who says he's going to advocate for the Muslim communities or other minority religious groups in India.
I mean, this is the lingo that's used, and I think that's where there are a lot of folks that are concerned about, and we're actually rooting against him.
Tell me who's concerned. What's the concern? What's wrong with Garcetti saying that?
I don't think there's anything wrong with Garcetti, but you got to understand.
India, I want someone who's going to represent everyone, not just the Hindus.
Right. No, that's true. At the same time, when you use, it's kind of coded language, the term human rights, when it relates to India, especially when we look at the human rights in America, right? We have a lot of communities that feel disadvantaged, whether you think they are or not. And the fact that human rights is always used in the context of India, even though India has been holistically a very inclusive country. India has Jews, it has Sikhs, it has Muslims.
What's the implication? What are you trying to say?
Well, the implication is, again, this goes down to Prime Minister Modi. This is what these debates are all about. The people that lost office can't get through now to the Modi supporters. Modi has a stranglehold on that electorate.
Okay,
he's a democratically elected.
Modi's been accused of being an Indian and Hindu nationalist and discriminating against Muslims and other religious minority groups. That's the point. Is that right?
Well, that's the accusation
Get to the
constantly.
Point. That's the point I'm talking about. Okay, so that's set, and Garcetti is now trying to deal with that criticism. Did he do it successfully? I don't know. You can't appease everyone in these situations, and that's the problem.
That's true, and that's also why, in addition to these allegations, I mean, it was really kind of a Democratic standoff. The Democrats actually had enough to get him elected a while ago, get him this appointment, but it took 2 years. They were trying to make a point.
Where's the evidence that the Democrats try to hold this up, or
that's actually a good question. That's a good question, Jonathan. I actually heard this from someone at the State Department that I met with, someone who's not affiliated with the State Department, but I went to a State Department event.
Why didn't any of these other lawmakers who were questioning Garcetti's appointment or confirmation, appointment rather, come up with that? Why didn't they just simply say that?
Again, this is all politics, man. Garcetti was not necessarily at the top of everybody's list, and some of these senators were just trying to hold it against him. And again, there were Republicans too. Also, I should point out, in the 52-42 vote, you had a bunch of Republicans cross the aisle. So in this case, we had a bunch of Democrats that did not confirm Garcetti. That's the point.
Yeah. Well, I don't think it had
Republicans cross the aisle.
Unless there's evidence, that's fine. I don't think it had anything to do with the human rights violations, allegedly, by the Modi administration.
It's just the tone. I think the tone offended a bunch of people. And if you look at the Republicans that crossed the aisle, the senator from Indiana and India have a budding relationship. If it really offended
so many people, where are the Indian groups? Where are the Hindu groups right now? Why aren't they speaking up forcefully against this?
Well,
I haven't seen any of that yet.
Through back channels, John.
Exactly. That's my point. That's their problem. They always go through back channels. If the Hindu groups like HIJACK want to, get some noise and attention, they would have put that out there. But they haven't yet, have they?
No, I mean there was. Listen, he got held up for 2 years. That's a pretty India. The U.S.-India relationship is a big deal.
I think if this was a big deal, HAF would have put something out, a press release saying
HAF does not speak for all Indian Americans. They're also looking at business and economic reasons. But I think Garcetti's political career, just to point out before we move on, Garcetti was looking at maybe trying to be California governor. He was one of those guys like your guy Dow Constantine in Washington. He's one of those guys that had an eye on a higher office, and he kind of got derailed in Los Angeles. So this is why he went the appointment route.
Exactly. So most of these folks, you get one of these ambassadorships, towards the end of your political career usually. So
anyway, we'll watch what he does, but he got through after a gauntlet over a couple of years. Moving forward now to Seattle, and Jonathan covered a story. He's been obviously following this homeless crisis going on up there for more than a year now. Jonathan, this park in downtown reopened after being really run down with encampments. Reopened. It looked like a beautiful reopening, but it looks like they had some activists protesting this reopening as well.
Yeah, and I think most folks, again, watching this, who may not have context, especially in the Pacific Northwest and West Coast, it is just absolutely wild. It's the far left activists, these violent Antifa members who have just, for the past 2 years, run, havoc and just rampage through the city streets to push their, usually communist or Marxist agenda. And you have remnants of that still here in Seattle. But what I saw at this park reopening, again, that was closed for more than a year because a homeless encampment took it over. It's been restored. It was a beautiful grand opening. These activists came in with a group called Stop the Sweep Seattle. They're against homeless encampment removal policies currently being implemented by the city of Seattle. The city of Seattle, for the record, always offers shelter and services. But what I'm finding on the front lines is that you have a lot of homeless folks saying it's not adequate, it's not enough, or they prefer to stay on the streets for various reasons. They just want the freedom. They want to live nomadically. They want to do the drugs. So anyway, this group comes in, tries to hijack the event. They delay it for 30 minutes, but here's the difference, and here's my point in closing. I saw really for the first time neighbors saying enough is enough. They're so sick of this urban decay, the failed social policies being implemented, and they want something new. And I know this isn't just Seattle. This also applies to San Francisco. And that's what I was going to ask you about. When's the last time you were at a homeless encampment, buddy?
I mean, dude, I live in the Bay Area. I was in San Francisco yesterday. You drive right by them, man. I mean,
so are the activists
most people
as rabid in San Francisco as they are in Seattle? I mean, I just haven't seen it. I know they're out there. I mean, my friend Kevin Dahlgren recently went on Fox and Friends this past week and even said that there are activists in San Francisco as well, and Portland and Los Angeles who will put up tents just to prove a point, to attract more homeless into a neighborhood, to show that capitalism is failing, to show that tents destabilize. I mean, they want to destabilize these communities just to prove their point. Are you seeing that in the Bay Area?
I mean, that's an interesting point that he brings up. I can't say that I know specifically this is the agenda, but, we do have a very progressive board of supervisors. It's far more to the left than I recall, 20 years ago. I mean, I interned at San Francisco City Hall 25 years ago. It was much more centrist, but the world has shifted, right? I mean, these cities on the West Coast have definitely gotten more left-leaning. I'll never forget Nancy Pelosi saying that she's a progressive. There's no way that Nancy Pelosi would be considered a progressive by people like Pramila Jayapal even, or
and Shama Sawant.
Right.
They're not progressive enough. They're not left enough.
Exactly. So I think things have changed politically, right? And you see this where if you're a centrist or you might be left-leaning, you are, certainly the far left is going to say you're not progressive enough. And at what point
the far left will call you, Kapur, a fascist.
Oh, I mean, that's
a Nazi.
That's the language.
You'll be a white supremacist.
I mean, frankly, that's the language I see on. I mean, listen, if I know you battle that on Twitter. That's the language you see on Twitter, which is why some people want to engage and some people don't.
No, that's the language I see being thrown at me, and when I'm being confronted by these far left activists and Antifa members in Seattle who just continue to push their agenda. And what's really sinister about this, again, is that at the end of the day, homeless men and women are being used as pawns. And it's just unbelievable. At the end of the day, the question I always ask is, when's the last time you took a homeless person into your own backyard? Kapur, I did that. I did that when I did, worked with the homeless in Chicago. I mean, I would respect these activists if they actually, lived out and practiced what they preached. I mean, at the end of the day.
Yeah, I think the big issue we see in San Francisco specifically is that they've just allowed. We've had a homeless problem in San Francisco my entire life. Okay, and my family had a small business in San Francisco. I would go there from the time I was a kid. Wherever you'd park a block away, there's homeless, not necessarily encampments, but homeless people. There's drug use, prostitution, all kinds of stuff you'd see out there on the streets. And I would see this at 8 years old, 10 years old. It was there, all there, and you would just see it and accept it. But now it's gotten to the point where you have huge city blocks. And what's also odd about San Francisco is that we have all these tourists come into downtown, and literally where the tourists stay is where all the encampments are. So it leaves an absolutely horrific impression on what San Francisco is.
And they don't want to come back.
Right.
And it's really because of failed policies. Look, at the end of the day, what's fueling this is housing first. And what housing first is something that was started under the Obama administration. And just for the record, I voted 2 times for President Barack Obama way back in the day. But when it comes to his homeless policy, it's a failure. And he said this year, 2023, he made this call roughly 10 years ago, homelessness across the nation would be eradicated and it would be gone. What I'm seeing, the numbers show it's getting worse, especially in these cities in the Pacific Northwest and the West Coast. Housing First is basically a failed policy that says, give homeless people apartments, studios, not shelters, but apartments and studios so you stabilize them. Even the drug addicts and folks with severe mental illness, warehouse them, get them out of sight and out of mind. Of course, they're going to say they do it because they want to make sure that these people can recover once they get behind closed doors.
But Jonathan, how many of these homeless folks, I don't know if anyone's done a study yet, but how many of these folks are out on the street because of economic reasons, or is it because of drug use or because of mental illness? Or a combination?
It's so hard to say. It really depends which study. As we all know, based on your agenda, the messaging you want to, push, you can, basically, pay for any study, and the study can, focus on your, talking points. But the point I was making is that this housing first policy that's currently being used as well under the Biden administration is it doesn't require any treatment for drugs or mental illness. In other words, people are being given apartments for free. And this is the key. You're only going to take the next step when you're ready. Okay? In other words, if you want to do drugs behind closed doors, go ahead. And you have people dying at a record pace now in Seattle of fentanyl overdoses behind closed door. Just this week, the King County Councilman Reagan Dunn just proposed a bill that will require all King County funded apartment complexes, taxpayer dollar funded complexes, to show the numbers and to keep track of how many people die of fentanyl overdoses. It's just out of control. So that's one of the main reasons. And due to my, because of my reporting, I've really exposed a lot of this stuff. And as I've reported numerous times, you have quite a few people on the streets right now who are chronically homeless, and they all say this is what they want. They just want to be left alone. It's stunning. And yet we're using these failed policies like a one-size-fits-all. Why would we use the same one-size-fits-all policy when, like you said, homelessness is a wide spectrum? You've got everyone from the single mom who had the rent raised, where housing first might work, where she just needs a hand because she's motivated to get off the streets, versus somebody who's been on the streets for 20 years who's like, I'm done. I'm detached from society. Leave me alone. And we're using the same policy to address this wide spectrum. It's just not common sense.
So this park reopening, Jonathan, are they going to enforce laws? Are there trespassing laws? Are there vandalism laws? Loitering laws?
Yeah, there are no camping, illegal camping bills on the books. But like you said, that's the key. Will they enforce? And they were tested right away. The very next day after the opening on Sunday, the grand reopening was a 2-day affair. The very next day, actually that evening, a tent popped up. But on Monday morning, the tent disappeared. It's unclear if the city moved in and cleared it, or if this homeless camper decided to move, on their own. But again, I think at least now in Seattle, the direction everything's going is, if it's a well-known area like a downtown Seattle or a well-known park that's had this much scrutiny, city leaders know all eyes are on Ballard Commons Park. So if anything happens, at least for the sake of the folks around Ballard Commons, I think they're going to sweep in and remove camps. But the question now is, how long will that last? how long will they be able to sustain and keep up with enforcement? So again, yet to be seen.
Yeah, and this is the big issue we have, is that I think there's a lot of folks that are compassionate towards the plight of all these folks, and that's why you have this conflict. But at some point, like, whatever solutions are out there so far, it does not seem to be effective, at least in Seattle. And I know you've mentioned
And
other
San
cities.
Francisco, and Los Angeles, and Portland. Is that really compassion to leave someone in a tent encampment and say, oh, we're not going to move them until we build apartments? That's a pipe dream. Makes no sense.
Yeah.
Welcome to the West Coast.
Yeah, no, it's a huge issue, and again, we also have NIMBYism as well, where there's a whole effort to build stuff around the state, and folks in elite communities don't want to see more development. They don't want their home prices to drop. It's this dichotomy of all this cheap money that got pumped into the economy the last decade as well, and some people got their hands out big time about the PPP loans and things of that nature, and some people got completely left behind. And
our producer Carrie's asking, what should we do about it? Hey, Carrie, if I knew the answer, I wouldn't be a journalist. Okay, nobody has I don't know what the right answer is, but I do know where we can start. We can start with housing earned. Okay, let's basically break down, find out who really wants to get off the streets. The folks who don't, well, guess what? We're gonna have to start enforcing the law.
All right, this is another debate. We'll continue as Jonathan keeps running on this beat here. Let's move on now to the Oscars. The Oscars, we don't really cover a lot of entertainment on this show. Frankly, it's just not my bag. I don't really spend a lot of time doing it. I've interviewed different celebrities. Actually, I think, Jonathan, you and I have both actually interviewed our fair share of celebrities. I'll tell you the most infamous one I interviewed. I interviewed Kevin Spacey years ago on the red carpet. His reputation got thrown in the mud very shortly thereafter. But the Oscars...
I hope he was appropriate with you.
I mean, he was there for like an Indian Oscars award show in Tampa Bay. Went out there years ago. So the Oscars, we had some Asian representation. Michelle Yeoh ended up winning an Oscar. We have a more diverse judge base now. They've made some real efforts. After people getting, again, Twitter being another mechanism to say Oscars so white. Hashtag Oscars so white. We had a couple of Indian award winners. We had a documentary film that won an Academy Award, and of course we had the Natu Natu song, which has become kind of a global, almost like the Gangnam Style type of song for the Indian community as it was for the Korean community.
And don't forget Ki Hui Kwan, man, short round from Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, and Encino Man winning for Best Supporting Actor, first Asian American male ever to win in that category.
And he was a guy whose career was basically derailed for decades, right?
Yeah, and he played the typical Asian stereotypical, roles of the nerd. I mean, that's what he played. He played literally a computer nerd in Encino Man, and after that, he pretty much hasn't acted. And yet, ironically, Brendan Fraser, who also won for Best Actor, and Kwan, they were both in Encino Man, and they win Best Actor and Best Supporting Actor. I think that's incredible.
Yeah, so I mean, this debate rages on whether the Oscars have done enough to diversify their base, because a lot of folks globally were like, hey, this is kind of like a local show. It's like an LA-based, Hollywood-based show. It's not truly a global reflection of the film industry. And so you've seen some changes. You've seen some more foreign films get in the mix. But I think it was interesting seeing the criticism this year with Natu Natu, the RRR song of the year. They had like a dance performance, and again, the song won the Oscar, but they had a bunch of dancers that were not South Asian, not Indian American, and there's only a few hundred of these kind of dancers doing this at a professional level. So there's a lot of criticism being levied to the Oscars, saying, hey, if you want to show true representation, make an authentic version, even though the dance, as portrayed in the movie, had a really diverse cast.
Are you saying it's time to bring back the hashtag Oscar so white? Is that what you're saying?
Well, I'm just saying that this wasn't like one or two like activists mad. There was like a lot of folks pretty upset about this, which I thought was interesting, because in years past, I think especially in the Indian community, they were just happy, like, wow, we had someone that might be Indian, or we had Ben Kingsley, who I think might be part Indian. He won Gandhi, right? He won an award for Gandhi, and they were like, oh wow, Ben Kingsley. So like Indians were like looking for any kind of representation at all. but to see some mainstream, attention was a big deal. And of course, Deepika Padukone, who's like this big Bollywood actress, she actually introduced the song and dance number. But I'm fascinated to know the dichotomy of young people now speaking out, because previous generations, even when we were youngsters, we were just happy to see anyone that was diverse. Now there's enough diverse faces to actually make a complaint. We still haven't seen the Oscars change that much, but it was interesting to see that kind of debate get out there in the ethos.
Okay, so where do you stand on this debate?
I mean, look,
the Oscars folks have brought on more Indians?
If you're going to want to truly have a global representation, then you need to have the judges reflect society. You need to have the dance teams. You need to have the presenters. And frankly speaking, as someone who we actually tried to go cover the Oscars this year because we knew there were multiple Indian groups up for awards, we applied and they didn't give us access, which is strange. I mean, we get access to virtually everything. So it shows. I'm like, why isn't we're the largest Indian American network in the United States? We're the largest Asian American network in the United States. Why aren't we allowed on the red carpet to talk to some of these celebrities that obviously our audience wants to hear from? So
you got iced out by the Oscars. It's just unbelievable. That hashtag, bring back Oscars so white. Once again, at the end of the day, it's fascinating. I don't want to get off on a tangent here, but the Oscars, can virtue signal all they want. They want to appoint, quote unquote, all these people of color on this board and that board. But, when it comes down to it, they drop the ball again.
Right. And this goes back, we talked about Michelle Yeoh briefly. Michelle Yeoh, I think you brought up this tweet that NPR, you sent that to me earlier this week, where Michelle Yeoh was, in a tweet, she identifies as Asian. I mean, I don't know what that means in that context. I think it was not a well-written tweet, but it certainly got a backlash because there have been other quote-unquote Asian Americans that have been nominated. It was great that Michelle actually took home the trophy, but it just seems that some of this stuff, I don't think the mainstream media or even a group that's as large as the Oscar committee, the Academy Awards, the folks that do this, maybe they don't realize how diverse the country is and they're in their own silos. They don't really realize the bubble they're in.
Yeah, I mean, let me just read the tweet here. NPR tweeted, quote, breaking, Michelle Yeoh wins the Oscar for Best Actress, making history as the first person who identifies as Asian to win the award. Twitter added context card later reading, the tweet is factually correct, but missing context to explain wording. Merle Oberon was the first Asian woman nominated for the Academy Award for Best Actress in 1935. Oberon hid her heritage to avoid discrimination. Michelle Yeoh, however, is open about her Asian heritage. So the reason why, hey, fine, that seems like a reasonable explanation. But the reason why this is a big deal is NPR should have known better as a news organization that is obviously leans liberal. I'm not accusing them of, not being fair and accurate in their reporting, but they should know the social climate we're in. And what I mean by that is, when you use words like identifies as for the right or for conservatives or folks who are just sick of being politically correct, that's charged language. That's like the woke, right? It's like, why do you even have to say that? Michelle Yeoh is obviously Asian American. And from my vantage point, it's like NPR, a majority white-run organization, will you at least let the Asian Americans have their moment without interfering with woke language, intended or not?
Yeah,
that's my take.
And what's interesting is some people will say she's not Asian American because she's from Malaysia. Again, I don't want to get into the semantics of the whole thing, but it is ridiculous when you see this kind of stuff. And this goes back to like talking about discrimination, where again Michelle Yeoh wins, and Merle Oberon, who I guess was part Indian or Sri Lankan, depending on how you want to connote her, she had hid her identity. This is very commonplace. I mean, there was a story I got introduced to a few years ago. A guy I used to work with at ABC. He did a documentary about a guy named Korla Pundit, who was an African American guy from, I believe, St. Louis, and then he portrayed himself as Indian and became like a celebrity in the 50s, wearing like a little turban. This is what people had to do back in the day to look different, to be unique, to get noticed, because maybe if he was just a regular black guy from St. Louis, they would have ignored him. I mean, this is what people have had to do historically, so I'm not surprised.
To make it in Hollywood.
Right.
To make it in white-controlled Hollywood. I get it. But we're in 2023 now, and that's the point, okay? Like, look, it's obviously clear, Michelle Yeoh, you don't need to put the qualifier that she identifies as Asian. That's my point. Obviously, it led to a firestorm on Twitter. I just, when I first read that, I was like, why? Why do we have to go down this road? It goes back to, again, the importance of language, right? Especially when you're in the news media and the language that you use to portray or tell a story. And I think if there is anything, if there is a lesson to be learned here, the still white-controlled media needs to understand that, you know, having, you know, people on staff who, again, know the political climate, the cultural context, again, use specific language that is, you know, my opinion, you know, not politically charged. I'm not saying that, I don't know who this person is who tweeted this. I don't know at the end of the day if it was a male or female. I don't know what's inside a man or a woman's heart and mind. So I'm not saying it was malicious, okay? But the point is, it caused a controversy. It was completely unnecessary, in my opinion, and it took away from the moment.
And I'm curious, actually, I want to get your take on identifies as, because where you're standing from, right? And I know you talk to a lot of folks on the left and the right. I mean, you're dealing with progressives and you're dealing with conservatives. And I'm curious to know where that is in the debate, because I think that's something we haven't really discussed at length on the show. But the identifies
it's still
as
there, and it's primarily rooted from the whole trans LGBTQ sexual identity debate, not necessarily even race. But everything's now been blurred, right? The line's been blurred. So, you know, I mean, literally there are stories out there. We've talked about this of white guys who are getting plastic surgery now to look like Korean K-pop stars, okay? And, you know, you're seeing white women trying to portray themselves as black women, and they're running diversity programs, okay? So I get it. I mean, there's been a lot of confusion out there, but I think, I mean, at this point, we don't need to go down this road, in my opinion. Let's just keep it simple, okay? This qualifying language, in my opinion, is just out of control. I don't know what your thoughts are. I
bring this up only because, you know, we really didn't plan to debate this particular topic, but, you know, San Francisco, my hometown, just put together a reparations bill, which is not going to actually lead any funding, but they ostensibly are going to give $5 million to people that identify as black. And they said you have to identify, at least through some public records, for like 10 years. And so that leads to a whole host of questions, right? Like, okay, maybe if someone had the foresight to identify as black for 10 years, they could qualify
on their birth certificate?
Yeah, I mean, you know, it just leads to all kinds of semantics and debates. And, you know, it's like, it's $5 million, plus it's like about $97,000 per adult person for like 250 years. Plus they get a home in San Francisco for $1 for your family.
Is, who was behind this at the end of the day? That's what I want to know.
I mean, listen, there's a huge reparations committee. I mean, we're talking like a dozen plus people, respected people. Reverend Dr. Amos Brown, who I saw speak in person just yesterday in San Francisco. I mean, these are actually, he's an iconic figure in San Francisco. So reputable people are behind this. And I'm not saying that reparations shouldn't be considered. I'm just curious about the language, especially the identifies as, especially now, because that's kind of fairly new vernacular, right? Where we didn't have that.
And again, it's language used by the wokes, it's used by the activists, and it's used by these left-leaning academics at the end of the day. And they're trying to impose it on American culture, and they've done it for decades. And they're now finally being called out, especially through the power of social media. And I think there's an enormous pushback to this. You know, it's just one of those situations where I think I'm always trying to think from the average person, average American, regardless of race, ethnicity, but the average American's lens and viewpoint. And the people I talk to on the ground, even in Seattle, are saying this is ridiculous. This is stuff I don't identify with. Speaking of identifying with, they don't relate at all to this. And it's happening so quickly that people are just trying to catch up to, you know, their latest television programs, let alone the language being used. And the reason why is people hate it now, because if you don't use it properly in certain contexts, people are afraid of now being canceled. It's this insane cancel culture. So if I don't use this proper language that some woke academic told me to use, I'm politically incorrect? Okay, fine. I guess I'm politically incorrect. I think people are just so tired of the media and academia telling us what language we need to use and essentially how to behave in America.
Yeah, I mean, people do get corrected quite a bit, and I'm fascinated to know where this is going because, I've talked to people that are like Indian American leaders who identify as Indian American. Some people say they're South Asian. Some people say I'm just American. I don't even identify as Indian, right? Like they're flatly of Indian lineage, but no, I'm American. And I mean, anybody
The
can, I guess.
question we need to be asking is, where is this coming from? Who is pushing this language? Where's the source? At the end of the day, it's gonna be majority white folks. It's virtue signaling, dude. If there's anything, I'm not all about this whole white supremacy stuff. And by the way, for the record, I am for reparations as well to a certain degree. Again, reasonable reparations. I don't know what that means. I'm not the expert. I'm not on this committee and board. There have been other groups throughout history that have received reparations. Japanese Americans who have been interned received reparations. I think black Americans absolutely should receive reparations to a certain degree. But this $5 million per person, I mean, this is just ridiculous. It's lunacy.
I think
how
the
do
challenge
you fulfill
is
that practically?
Yeah, I mean, San Francisco is what I find strange is, and I understand you want to go through the process, but San Francisco is not going to pay this out.
Exactly.
It's like,
never
if you're going to
gonna
go
happen.
through it, then go through it. Don't just have this debate and get people riled up and have all this emotional outburst and not actually follow through.
That's right, because at the end of the day, it hurts black people who will then never see a penny because of this entire debate that's created over this ridiculous number. That's exactly where I stand as well. If we're going to do it, let's do it, but let's do it in a reasonable way, not this insane, $5 million per person with, qualifying language or identifies as, as a requirement. I don't know, man.
And I think there is a movement that's due in the state of California. And obviously most of the really heinous stuff, again, not to say the bad stuff didn't happen in California back in the day, but certainly in the South, a lot of these states aren't even considering a bill like this. And that's where I think I'd be really interested to see if the federal government steps in or some of these states where there was really heinous activity going on. But
yeah,
again, another debate for another day.
Yeah, and again, I think, reparations to a certain degree are extremely important.
All right, let's get into another Asian American hate crime that we are getting a chance to profile thanks to the California Public Library, who is supporting this message because another ridiculous incident took place, this one in Houston, where a mom of three, 44 years old, was body slammed to the ground by a young man. And the worst part is, it's one thing to get attacked. It's another thing that she has been now left paralyzed. And her husband passed away a few years ago, so she's a single mom of three that's now left in a position where she's paralyzed because of this reprehensible crime. Jonathan, when we started doing these segments, I'm appreciative that we get a chance to highlight this thing week after week, but it seems like the violence is just unending. Like this is not the first clip of the week. Like, we see scores of these things and we make a choice. Okay, this one was maybe the most reprehensible of all the other incidents that took place this week. And I don't know when this is going to end, but I mean, I'd like to think this pandemic is coming to a close. I'd like to think that we're going to get back to socialization, but it seems like this thing is going on and on and on.
Socialization. I mean, look, first of all, let me say for the record, it's hard to say right now if this was an actual hate crime. It was a robbery for sure. Houston PD, basically they're not looking at this as a hate crime. They're looking at this as simply a classic robbery. But again, the suspect, and I hate to say this over and over again, but is unfortunately once again a black male, apparently a very young black male, perpetrator. And the optics look horrible here. I mean, over a little more than $4,000, you body slam a woman, she's left paralyzed in a wheelchair? I mean, this is ridiculous. And, it's just, there's so many insane things. Look, I think most reasonable folks, especially in the black community, they're speaking out and they're going to condemn this. I mean, this is unbelievable, but it almost goes back to, why are Asian Americans continuing to be targeted, whether it's for a hate crime or in instances like this? And I think there are a lot of reasons out there, and I've reported on this, and many have as well. Asian Americans are seen as quiet, weak, and if something happens to them, they're likely not going to report it. Okay? They don't want to bring attention. Number two, Asian Americans, especially Asian women, are known to carry large amounts of cash because they don't trust the banking system, right? So in this case, ironically, a woman was taking money out of the ATM, according to police, and it appears to be targeted because this perpetrator was watching her. But man, it's just unbelievable that this just keeps on happening. And I want to know why there isn't more national coverage, right? Now, in fairness, Houston local media covered this. That's why we're talking about it. Other, Asian news-focused outlets like Nextshark covered this. We're talking about it now. There's an entire segment, but this still happens. And then afterwards, my concern is that's it. It's a story, goes through the news cycle, and that's it. When we need to be talking about the dynamics here.
Right. And again, there are panel discussions. I was in one yesterday in San Francisco where they were talking about hate crimes, really kind of broadly. It wasn't specific to Asian Americans, even though Asian Americans took part in this discussion that I saw. But again, we have not hit a threshold where we're seeing a huge reduction in these kind of crimes. And so I'm starting to get actually extremely concerned. I was hoping that this was just a cyclical situation where a combination of the pandemic and folks being, locked up at home or, being away from their families, friends. Like we had a real challenging couple years globally, and so
and people could blame Trump as the boogeyman and so on and so forth when he was in office, but he's not here anymore. As we had stop AAPI hate using Trump as a reason for a rise in Asian hate, but that's not here anymore.
Yeah. So again, we just wanted to highlight another sinister situation, and we hope this lady heals. I don't even know what to say, but it's a terrible situation that we wanted to point out once again, and we're going to keep on this and find out if there's going to be additional measures to figure out a solution on this. Jonathan, any final words before we wrap this up?
Yeah, no, I think what we need to be doing more of as well as I'm watching just the mainstream media fail in this coverage and also the national landscape when it comes to the actual conversations and also public policy impacting the schools, funding. Asian Americans continue to be targeted. And if we're not reporting this stuff, if we're not holding even our public officials accountable for not focusing more on what's happening with ongoing Asian hate, no one else will. So we got to just keep on shining a spotlight on
right.
this.
Well, there's not enough guys like you and I in the quote-unquote mainstream media any longer. That's the issue in terms of why this is not getting highlighted.
I think that's why we need to go alternative media. So
yeah, that's what we're here for. For Jonathan Choe, I'm Ravi Kapur. We'll see you again next time here on Protected Speech.